Have you been paying taxes all this time without needing to? So tax season is almost upon us here in the U.S. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the U.S. government will collect $2.6 trillion in individual income taxes in 2025. During tax time, you may hear or read about how the 16th Amendment and the right of the U.S. government to collect income taxes is unconstitutional and therefore illegal to collect and should not be paid. From William Benson's book, The Law That Never Was, claiming that the 16th Amendment is not legitimate for many reasons which we will cover in this video, to Irwin Schiff and the tax protester movement, arguing paying federal income tax is voluntary, down to the U.S. Supreme Court itself, declaring the income tax law unconstitutional in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co., many will claim that for any or all of these reasons, the U.S. is stealing from its citizens. So, have you been paying taxes all this time without needing to? We're going to go through these arguments and put them to the test, and by that, I mean read the actual wording of the Constitution, amendments, and tax code, and see if there really is any merit in these arguments. I find oftentimes that many tax protesters know the arguments about why we shouldn't have to pay taxes, but don't know the actual Constitution. It's good to know both. It all starts with Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. While the main focus of this section of the document is on the lawmaking process and the requirements of Congress, it also has a dedicated portion to money, taxes, and collection. And pirates. Everyone forgets about pirates being referenced in the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 states this: "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." So this gives Congress the general power to tax. It also requires that indirect taxes, like tariffs, be applied uniformly across all states to ensure no state is favored over the others. The other important portion that mentions tax is in Article 1, Section 9. "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken." This originally required direct taxes, such as property taxes, to be apportioned among states based on their population. And this is where all of the trouble stems from. If you're wondering what the heck is a direct tax and what does it mean to be apportioned among states, a direct tax is a tax that is one levied directly on individuals without the need for an intermediary. These are often taxes on property or wealth. The Constitution required that any direct taxes imposed by Congress must be apportioned or divided among the states based on their population, meaning that if Congress needed to raise, say, $100,000 in direct taxes, each state's share of the tax would be in proportion to its population as determined by the U.S. Census. California would have the largest chunk, being the most popular state. In the middle would be states like Georgia, having to pay 3%, and states with very few people, like Alaska, would pay less than 1%. This is how taxation worked before the 16th Amendment. Now, before the 16th Amendment, the federal government relied mostly on tariffs or import taxes and excise taxes, which are taxes on goods like alcohol and tobacco, to maintain the government. It's crazy to think our federal government back then had a budget that was maintainable by these simple taxes, considering how overtly large and wasteful our government is today. But that's all that was really needed to run the ship back then. As the U.S. economy grew and became more industrialized, the federal government needed more revenue to fund public services and infrastructure. Then the Civil War happened, ballooning our government debt by 4,000%. This led to some drastic changes for our country and government. The first big change was that Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861, which introduced the first federal income tax in U.S. history. It was a graduated income tax based on income levels, ranging from 3 to 5%. Now, they sold this income tax as a temporary wartime measure and promised to revoke it after the war. The other major change that we saw was the IRS being created in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln to enforce these tax laws. The IRS is an agency under the Department of the Treasury and operates under laws passed by Congress. The income tax was not easy to enforce. The tax system was complex and required a robust infrastructure to assess and collect taxes from individuals, businesses, and landowners. Eventually, Congress moved to repeal the 1861 income tax in 1872. The war was over, the government had sufficient revenue from customs duties and excise taxes and no longer needed the income tax. And the questions regarding the constitutional legality of income tax were now avoided when it went away. But as the economy continued to evolve and economic inequality grew larger and larger and total business monopolies became a thing, the people themselves began to demand an income tax. You heard that right. If the government is mainly collecting taxes from tariffs and excise tax on alcohol and other goods, in this example, a $1.10 tax for each gallon of whiskey, that means a farmer who earns $500 a year pays the same amount as the monopoly guy who makes $50,000 a year or more. And as Monopoly Man grows wealthier and wealthier, the $1.10 tax becomes completely negligible for him. All the while, the farmers or laborers are actually paying a larger portion of their wealth to these taxes. So yeah, the common man was going to pay 2% of their annual taxes on these excise taxes anyways. Now with an income tax specifically targeting the wealthier citizens are now going to contribute their fair share. So in 1894, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which included a 2% income tax on high earners only. And this is a very small percentage of citizens that had to pay this. We're talking 1 or 2% of the people, and everything was rainbows and sunshine for about 9 months. Then the Supreme Court struck down parts of the 1894 income tax law in a landmark case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Co., ruling that income tax was a direct tax under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. And if it's a direct tax, then according to the Constitution, it must be apportioned by the states. And if this can't be done, then the income tax law is unconstitutional. Now, the ruling here made it nearly impossible for Congress to impose an income tax effectively. And when the Supreme Court makes up their mind, that's that. The only thing that can overturn the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court itself. They do this with some regularity, most recently when they overturned Roe v. Wade. The other way to overturn the Supreme Court's ruling is to change the Constitution through the amendment process. Now, the old ruling is based on the old document, not the updated document, and we need new rulings. So President William Howard Taft called for an income tax amendment in 1909, and shortly after, the 16th Amendment was proposed and ratified in 1913. It states, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." This overturned the Pollock decision and ensured that income taxes could be levied without apportionment. After which, Congress did their thing, quickly passing the Revenue Act of 1913, imposing the first modern federal income tax. And that is the brief history of how we got here today, the year of our Lord 2025, in which the U.S. government will collect $2.6 trillion in individual income taxes. All right, let's get to the arguments already. First up, the 16th Amendment did not actually give Congress the power to tax incomes, but merely clarified existing powers. This guy explains the argument better than I can.
It's actually very simple. Congress tried to enact an income tax in 1894. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. When the Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional. They tried again in 1913, and the Supreme Court said the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation. So if they didn't have it then, and they didn't get it, they don't have it. There is no constitutional basis for a tax on the wages of Americans living and working in the 50 states of the Union. Period. End of argument.
This one's great. The crux of the argument falls on one particular Supreme Court case, Brushaber versus Union Pacific Railroad Co. Now, Brushaber objected to paying the income tax and filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the tax, arguing that the 16th Amendment had given Congress new powers that were not originally granted in the Constitution. He also argued it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, but the argument we are looking at doesn't focus on this portion of his case. Now, what does he mean when he says new powers? By allowing Congress to impose an income tax without apportionment, the 16th Amendment was essentially granting new sweeping powers that did not exist prior to the amendment's ratification. The court did not agree with Brushaber, reaffirming their ruling that income tax was a valid form of taxation under the Constitution, now free from the apportionment requirement. But the one thing they did agree with him was that Congress was given no new powers. And this is the driving point for those wishing to avoid paying income tax. The Supreme Court stated that Congress had no new powers from the 16th Amendment. If they have no new powers, and their previous power to levy an income tax was found to be unconstitutional, then income taxes right now must be unconstitutional. But the snippet taken from the Supreme Court ruling that Congress was given no new power is really taken out of context when you look at the actual ruling in the case. The Supreme Court affirmed that the 16th Amendment was essentially a clarification of Congress's existing power to tax income. It didn't add any new power. It eliminated the apportionment restriction that was used in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co. to declare the tax unconstitutional. Brushaber lost his argument and had to pay his taxes. I find many tax protesters ignore this fact completely. It's funny how one of the greatest arguments against paying an income tax, that no new powers were given to Congress, comes from a Supreme Court case that is a landmark decision in defending the income tax and the ability of Congress to impose one. Go ahead and petition for a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court to argue income taxes. They will refer back to the decision of the Brushaber's case as why the income tax is constitutional. I also find it strange that people that pursue this line of logic seem to ignore how an amendment overrules the Supreme Court. You don't hear anyone applying the same logic process to black freedom and citizenship. As we remember, the Supreme Court case Dred Scott versus Sanford decided that black citizenship was unconstitutional, whether they were slave or freed people. The 13th Amendment completely altered the Constitution. Once the Constitution was changed, it was irrelevant to state that the Dred Scott case declared blacks as non-citizens. The ruling was no longer valid because it was based on a court that applied a ruling of an outdated constitution. There have been other rulings of the Supreme Court overturned by new amendments as well. To put your blinders on, take a snippet of a ruling, and bury your head in the sand as you argue why you shouldn't have to pay taxes is not a winning strategy. And obviously, the courts have agreed to this interpretation as well. You can't use this argument to get out of paying taxes. Okay, next up. The 16th Amendment may grant Congress the ability to impose an income tax constitutionally, but it was never ratified legitimately. Okay, these arguments and other similar ones all stem from William Benson's book, The Law That Never Was, from 1985. Pretty interesting read. Benson argues that states either misreported having ratified the amendment, had incomplete documentation of their procedures and records, or that states were missing signatures on their documents. All of these issues, in Benson's mind, meant that the 16th Amendment was invalid, and therefore, no one should have to pay income taxes. In each state that was accused, investigations were opened, many leading to verifiable proof that the documentation was done correctly with the proper signatures. Other states that did not have their original documentation provided alternative documentation sources such as government reports or historical accounts from the time, which cited the ratification, and Secretary of State certifications or other state-level archival documentation that confirm the action taken by the state legislatures. But Benson wasn't finished. He also argued that several states, 22 to be exact, approved the amendment with changes in wording, and one state with variations in the spelling. He also pointed out that at least 26 states approved the amendment with changes in punctuation. I know, these revelations are groundbreaking, But I really commend the dedication and sheer effort and man-hours he put in to compare all of these documents to one another. The man really didn't want to pay income taxes. So if you're not in the know, the wording of the amendment is not up for debate in the ratification process. States can't change word by word these proposals. After it has been proposed by Congress and written up and voted on, and when it is then sent to the states for ratification, the wording cannot be changed. If it could, then we would end up with 50 different versions of an amendment, which is no good. Benson's argument is that because there were minor grammatical, spelling, and punctuation changes in different states, that the amendment is invalid. However, courts have consistently ruled that these minor differences do not invalidate the amendment. Even with minor grammatical or spelling changes, the meaning and intent of the amendment has not changed. What do we have here next? The U.S. tax system violates the Fifth Amendment, also known as self-incrimination. This argument is very clever. The Fifth Amendment protects individuals from self-incrimination, also known as your right to remain silent. Observe.
Plead the fifth. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anything you say, 5. Go ahead, ask me a question. Did you?
Tax protesters claim that providing financial information on a tax return, a person could be incriminating themselves. Like if someone underreports their income or makes an error, they could be investigated for tax fraud. Since the IRS has the power to criminally prosecute tax evasion, forcing people to file tax returns is essentially forcing them to testify against themselves. And to back up this argument, many tax protesters cite cases like Marchetti versus the United States and Grosso versus the United States, both in 1968, where the Supreme Court ruled that requiring an individual to register as an illegal gambler violated the Fifth Amendment because it was essentially an admission of criminal activity. And so because illegal gamblers can plead the Fifth and don't have to file themselves as being involved in illegal activities, then citizens should also be able to plead the Fifth so as not to register themselves as tax evaders. Now, the simple answer here is filing a tax return does not assume criminal conduct. It is a neutral legal requirement under the 16th Amendment. It can't possibly be compared to a self-registration of illegal gamblers. Like, just compare these two forms on the screen right now. It doesn't take a court of law to determine that one of these questions does not assume you are a criminal and the other one does. But here's the best part. If a specific question on your tax return might incriminate you, you can invoke the Fifth Amendment. For example, if a person is under investigation for illegal income, they might claim the Fifth Amendment to avoid admitting to criminal earnings, but they still have to file a tax return on their legitimate legal earnings. This was proven in a Supreme Court case, the United States versus Sullivan, where the court ruled that a taxpayer must file a return, but could invoke the Fifth Amendment selectively if a specific question was incriminating. We're getting a little lost in the weeds on this one. It's fascinating. But to recap, filing a tax return is not a violation on your Fifth Amendment rights. You can plead the Fifth on parts of the return that might incriminate you, but you must file the return. Everyone must. Okay, this next one is the big one, the most popular one on social media. The argument being, paying income taxes is voluntary. Only suckers pay their taxes to the government. This all stems from the IRS themselves using the term voluntary compliance, leading many to believe that paying income tax is optional. Now, this term comes from an actual IRS educational material used to explain what it is and how it works. I'm not making this stuff up. It's a document called Understanding Taxes, Theme 1, Your Role as a Taxpayer. And it specifically cites the U.S. income tax system is built on the idea of voluntary compliance. Compliance is voluntary when taxpayers declare all of their income. As for the tax code itself, the actual law, it does not specifically mention the term voluntary compliance. You can run a search function on the transcript. Nothing will come up. So if it doesn't mean that taxes are voluntary to be paid, what does it mean? Voluntary compliance essentially equates to taxpayers are expected to self-report their income and calculate their tax liability without direct government intervention. Your income is not monitored as closely as you think. That's the whole purpose of the IRS asking you to voluntarily report what you earned. If they already knew all of that information, they wouldn't need you to report it. If what you report doesn't match from what information they do monitor, then you may be audited and the microscope will be put to you, your business, accounts, and earnings to make sure you reported accurately. The IRS does not directly monitor individual bank accounts without a cause. If you're under some criminal investigation, then yeah, they have cause to do so. However, banks must report any kind of deposit that's over $10,000. These are anti-money laundering laws, or any kind of suspicious transaction that may indicate tax evasion or fraud. There's also third-party reporting, where employers, banks, and other financial institutions are required by law to report income information to the IRS. The IRS will cross-reference this information with your tax returns that you filed to check for accuracy. And this is how the term voluntary compliance comes about. There shouldn't be anything confusing about this. The actual legal requirement to file and pay taxes is clearly stated in the following sections. Title 26 of the U.S. Code, Section 6012. This requires individuals to file an income tax return if they meet the income threshold. Title 26 of the U.S. Code, Section 6151. This requires payment of taxes when due. And Title 26 U.S. Code, Section 7203, in which criminal penalties for failing to file or pay taxes are laid out in detail. It's all there in black and white for anyone to read, and it even has a little tutorial section that you can go over as a student or teacher. I wish I was making this up. If someone fails to comply voluntarily, the IRS has the power to audit, levy wages, seize property, and impose criminal penalties under Title 26 of the U.S. Code. Pay your taxes. We actually killed two birds with that stone. We just answered this other argument that a lot of tax protesters like to bring up, and that is, there is no law requiring Americans to pay income tax. This is obviously false. We just listed the 3 sections of the U.S. Code that clearly state income taxes must be filed and paid. Okay, I'm in no way advocating that how the government spends our tax dollars is wonderful, and that's why we need to file taxes. I'm trying to keep my own feelings out of it. But I do take issues with people bringing up really bad arguments that can be solved with a bit of light reading and common sense. Social media and the advent of the 30-second video clip have done a lot to convince people that the government and our governing documents have really simple loopholes. But this is simply not the case. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.